The U.S. Securities Exchange Commission is proposing new rules on executive pay. The regulator wants to make it easier for shareholders in publicly traded companies to determine if executive pay matches up with the financial performance of the firm. Companies would have to include a new table in annual proxy filings disclosing actual pay and how it measures up to the firm's financial returns. The move comes as some shareholders have passed resolutions pushing back against company pay plans. On Tuesday, investors in Barrick Gold voted down that company's compensation practices, and last week it was CIBC shareholders who did the same. Time for the big picture. Bill Robson is President and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of Hill & Knowlton Strategies Canada, and Armin Yalnuzan, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I'm looking for a panelist with a shorter title. If anybody could offer one up. Bill, we talk a lot about pay, and particularly over time where this debate has gone as settled is linking pay for performance. We have this idea, and I guess we'll start there even though I don't agree with it, but we have this idea that as long as the company does extremely well and investors do extremely well, pay can be whatever. Are we doing a good job of linking pay to performance so far, or is this a plan with some merit?
I think that we are doing a better job than we used to. We could have pay linked to length of title. We're all working to make our titles longer, sorry to complicate things.
Goldie wins.
I think that probably, I'll call this a step in the right direction. We'll get to some unintended consequences in a minute, but the idea that you would make it more transparent to people how these things work does make sense. There are some odd things that happen, deferred compensation. We've talked about pensions on this show before. It's notoriously difficult for people to figure out how much it's worth and what the metrics are for achieving it. So it's hard to object to the general direction here, and I'll stop there for now because there is more to say.
All right, Armin, what's your take on this? Is this a sound plan, at least in principle?
Well, remember, it comes in the wake of the 2008 crisis, so it's post-crash economics. And what that did was everybody started asking, why is this person worth so much when so many people are worth so much less? So I took a look at the Canadian numbers. In 1998, the average of the top 100 CEOs was worth 105 times that of a full-time, full-year worker. 10 years later, it's 195 times, and 237 times that of a woman. So why are these people worth so much more? It's actually a really good exercise, some discipline to say, why is the value of this person so much higher than the average person?
Goldie, okay, so there's actually two thoughts there, right? One is just the sheer level, which I think is a conversation worth having. The other one is tying it to the performance of the company and doing it in a way that's easy to read. I mean, I think I have to say I get a giggle every time I see the words actual pay. Like there's going to be a line in the proxy that says, before we were lying, but here's the truth. But anyway, clarity is important.
Well, it is, and I think Armin hits an important point, and that is it all really started in 2008. That's one trigger, but I think there are a couple of other triggers that we should be aware of. Demographics alone, people are older, they're getting smarter, they're getting wiser, they're spending more time looking at their investments, they're asking more questions, and that's partly linked to the third point, and that is the landscape in which this is taking place is a digital era in which transparency, accountability, I want more information, I have a right to that information, is here to stay. And I think what you're seeing here is almost a Chinese torture approach with corporations to get with the program that this is not going to go away, this is going to stay. And if sunlight is the best disinfectant, they'd best get used to the idea as to how to deal with these issues before these board meetings and the AGMs happen, because as I said, it's going to come again and again.
So if I can be the skunk at the garden party now, there are some problems with this. First, I do want to say, though, before 2008, I mean, the compensation committees of boards of directors were doing much harder work over time than they had been in the past. So this is a trend that's been continuing, but here are a couple of the problems. First, the more transparency in pay you have, the more it may ratchet things up. I mean, we've seen that happen already. Another thing that's a bit more subtle, but many of the viewers will know a lot about this, is that many of the votes that are cast in response to these resolutions are on the basis of the proxy advisory firms. There's a big advisory industry out there that's making these calls. Companies are rejigging their compensation packages to get a positive assessment from the proxy advisory firms. And there's even some suggestion, there's at least one academic paper that says when companies do that, it's to satisfy that agent who's making money off what they're doing, but it actually doesn't help the shareholders. If anything, it might be negative. So we got to watch how this information is used, and we got to watch how the type of things people are asking for, because it might not actually help shareholders.
Okay, one thing that has happened lately, and it's notable, right? The Barrick, the CIBC, we're seeing more of it in the U.S. I mean, for years and years, we did have big shareholders who would rattle the cages, and then they would get to the AGM, and the vote would not go that way. And you would kind of throw your hands up and say, well, why is it all rhetoric? Why don't you actually vote? These are non-binding, by the way, but still, it's embarrassing for a company. I mean, let's talk about sheer levels. I mean, you were talking about kind of the ratio of pay. Is there a better way to go about this? Because we have this discussion all the time, and people have said to me repeatedly, this is a market, and you need to pay these people because otherwise you'll lose them, they'll go somewhere else. And I say, every time it comes up, poppycock. I just don't believe it. I think it is a market of some sort, but I think it's become so skewed. What's a good way? Is it a ratio? Or how do we come up with a way to keep this in line?
Well, I don't know what the answer is to that question, but you know you've got a problem when at Barrick 75% of your shareholders are saying you shouldn't have given yourself a 36% increase,
right,
or your board shouldn't have given you a 36% increase. I don't know what the right number is, but we don't. First of all, you pointed out that it's non-binding. So what this is partly a venting process and it's partly an accountability process, but we don't even have mandatory disclosure. That might hit. It is mandatory right now in Australia, in Switzerland, in the UK, and it might be mandatory next year in the US, but we only had 147 companies even offering the information.
Right.
And then again, the shareholders have the opportunity to vote, but they can't change anything. What's that about?
Bill, do you have a thought about how we can right this wrong, if you indeed think it's a wrong?
Well, if you put a really hard-edged thing on it, then you're going to have a problem because companies don't have to list. And we're seeing, the Securities Exchange Commission here, just as the SEC and the OSC, these securities commissions are often saying they want public companies to do this, that, and the other thing that actually don't have anything to do with their mandate to protect the shareholders. And if public companies get enough of that kind of regulatory attention that's not actually helping anybody do their job properly, the public company is going to decide to go private. So we got to be careful how we're using these tools.
Well,
I
but
think
there's a reason. Companies go public for a reason, right? Because they can tap resources they wouldn't otherwise have access to. I'm not too worried about the ones that want to, do without that money.
I wouldn't want to be in an economy where there weren't as many public companies, because it's a very efficient way to raise capital.
Yeah.
But if you start to have the regulator asking them to do all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the business, then a lot of companies will say, "I'd rather be owned by a pension fund and just do that
But this
all
isn't
privately."
just the regulator. This is not just the regulator that's
We're talking about
concerned.
the
This is like
SEC
the
here.
public is worried about value of work. Like
Yeah.
some people seem to be getting compensated with no relation to reality. And
All right,
this is a meta-level conversation.
Yes, it is. Goldie, you want in?
But this proposal that the SEC is going to be putting forward is probably better than the alternatives that we're hearing, which is much more about actually government intervention, government regulation, legislation. That, I think, is wrong. I think it is about the market. I do think the market has a determining effect, but ultimately the market holds the boards and the shareholders to account. This is bringing it all to a head, and ultimately performance pay is a critical component of it.
It is, but Goldie, you could maintain all your kind of meritocratic tendencies and your performance pay if you said you passed a law that said the CEO's pay should never be more than 100 times the median pay of your employees. I think what would happen is people would get raises. I think all of the rank and file would suddenly be making a lot more money, not CEOs taking a pay cut.
That sounds terrible.
And that would be great for the economy, right? What's wrong with that?
Can I get in here and just say the role of the
You don't
securities
get 20
regulator is
seconds
to protect the investors? And what you've just mentioned has nothing to do with protecting the investors. So let's make sure we pick up the right tool for
Fair
the
enough.
purpose.
I'm not talking about regulators here. I'm talking about lawmakers passing laws.
Right.
Yeah. All right. That's the big picture. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.